I've said it before, that if I had to break it down, or if I was asked what is one of the ways you can describe the main problem that leads to human suffering, and one of the answers to that question would be it's a very specific type of thinking. It's a type of thinking that sees information as absolute and then hangs on to it in a way that excludes other angles that we have about a particular topic or about ourselves, about life, that is held to be not an angle, but rather the truth. And when that happens, obviously, the irony of it is that the truth, which is something more holistic, is obscured by the fact that we are holding something that is part of the whole, an angle, a perspective, something that is by default, if it is part of the whole, not absolute, so we could call it relative, because we are holding the relative as if it is absolute, then something more holistic gets covered up by the fact that we're making a mistake and thinking, oh, this is a holistic view. And so when we take an idea, a concept, which is maybe very accurate in relation to a certain discussion, or a concept that says something relative to a certain topic, and outside of that topic, that particular wording mightn't hold relevant, mightn't hold true. So, for example, let's see if we can think of. Oh yes, okay. I can't remember. It's one of another sort of spiritual teacher that is focused on, quite a well-known, used to be a scientist in the area of genetics, I think, and is very focused on healing of the body, and has seen from his experience that healing and change in the body is very much linked to one's thinking about oneself, which can, as it changes, release certain dynamics that lead to changes and improvements in certain conditions. And so in his teaching, he will actually say, that the notion that you are stuck, essentially, according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, or your genes determine, and they're fixed and they're not going to change. So this notion that you are not in control but are being controlled by your genes is nonsense. And the reason that statement is made is that it's being made in the context of teaching an objective, which is to think differently. And in thinking differently, the suggestion is that thinking will bring about change in the system. And so if someone was they're saying, oh, if I have a certain way of being or a certain illness, then that's a result of my genetics and there's nothing I can do about it. Now, if someone was to say that in relation to what he's teaching and the objective that is key in what he's putting forward, which is healing of illnesses, if someone was to say that, essentially they're cutting off any capacity to listen to what is being said by bringing a notion, an idea that may be very relevant within another context into the context that he's delivering, which is with the objective of bringing about physical healing. Now, that's not to say that they aren't sharing some common ground, because he might say it's not just about physical healing. It's about a much more integral healing. But my point here is that what he's actually saying is that as your thinking changes, then certain structures are going to change, which is not any different from what I would put forward and say, in each moment you are a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and your up-to-date conditioning is always changing because of new conditioning. And so if we hear something and we find that new thinking happens, that new thinking is a result of the new conditioning, and then we change because we are then, according to our genes and the up-to-date conditioning. So it's saying it differently. On the one hand, he's saying, don't have the idea that you are fixed. If you think differently, you change. And so the statement that says you are not a slave to your genes is basically saying, hey, have confidence that change can happen. Because a lot of people might hear you're a slave to your genes and therefore say, well, if that's the case, nothing's going to change. And the notion that says you are a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning is not saying nothing will change. It's saying it will change according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so I'm not criticizing the fact that the statement is made that says, you are not a slave to your genes, because as I'm trying to point out, it's put forward in the context of achieving a certain objective and within the context of a certain teaching. And then in another teaching, so let's say what I say, we are not the doers. We are forced to act in each moment according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, it can seem like they are the same statements. One saying that you are a slave to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. The other one is saying, hey, don't think you're a slave to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. You can change. And I think that comment is fine. It's accurate if it's held in the right context. So the point is that a concept can be correct relatively, because if you take it out of one context and put it into another, it's not accurate in that context. But in another context, if we understand why it's being said and what point it's trying to make, and you say, well, that statement is accurate. So they are exactly the same concept in terms of the words. And in one context, you could say the statement that says you are not a slave to your genes, you can change, If it's heard as saying that, then you say that's an accurate concept. You are not a slave to your genes. Because his suggestion, the whole point is that we don't have fixed genes, but we have genes that are continuously affected by the environment. So it's the concept of epigenetics. And your genes and up-to-date conditioning essentially is the same concept of epigenetics, just described differently. So in one context, a statement that says you are not a slave to your genes is accurate. In another context, that same statement is inaccurate, which really means that that concept, any concept, is not the truth. If it was the truth, it would hold true in every single situation. And we need to start looking at concepts, understand where a concept comes from and what it is. So it's a description. It's a description of something from a certain perspective. And if you go around the back of that something and describe it from a different angle, from a different perspective, from a different person's point of view, maybe, it's going to seem different. If we see a situation from with more information, the concept might change. So one of the biggest problems is that we tend to form concepts about life, about ourselves, and hold them as if they are true. And holding it as if it's true tends to mean we're not open. We're not able to understand that another concept can simultaneously exist along with the one that we're holding. And that's actually what creates closed-mindedness. And it means that we tend to know ourselves in a very fixed way. And the reality is that if we know ourselves in a fixed way, we don't really know ourselves. Because a fixed way means it's an idea, it's a thought. A thought can be fixed. A concept can be fixed. The thing itself is always changing. So as soon as we put a concept onto the thing and mistake that concept for the self, which means mistake a concept that is static. So the words are static and can only be accurate from a certain perspective. If we don't realize that that concept is only accurate to some extent and that the thing can never really be captured, if this is not understood, then we will hold the concept as a representation of the whole thing. Now, this might seem like, I don't know, technical, irrelevant to the movement of freedom, of knowing, I don't know, the absolute, or knowing oneself, or enlightenment, liberation, whatever. But as I said, starting off, if someone asked me, having gone through a process where certain obstacles or certain structures that turn into or create suffering have changed, and being aware of that process of change and being able to see it from the other side, what would you say one of the biggest obstacles is, or what would you describe? And so I don't say this lightly. I actually think, I often think to myself, what is one of the biggest problems if I look at it not from just repeating cliched concepts, but if I sort of investigate the process itself and see what one of the biggest changes is. And not only one of many big changes, but rather, what could I say, the underlying principle for many of the changes is? And my answer would be that it is the falling away of holding something that is relative as less than relative, i.e., mistaking something that is relative being absolute. And all that only happens that can only happen through our thinking. So the more that we can question our ways of seeing things, the more we see that, oh, that's a belief, then the more freedom comes, the more we're allowed to change. And so within the context of spiritual seeking, I know from personal experience and from seeing it around that there are a huge number of spiritual beliefs, concepts that have been delivered through spiritual teachings, the right intention, as part of a very powerful and valid teaching. So all teachings essentially are delivering concepts. They have to, anything that is spoken or written down is a concept. It's not the truth. So, so that's not a criticism of teachings. You can't have a teaching that is telling you the truth, because a teaching can only tell you a concept. The Bible or the Quran or any holy text that exists throughout of time has never told us the truth. It has given us concepts describing what maybe you could say are pointers to the truth. And those pointers, when we look at them, essentially, they are always working on our thinking, such as to, over time, break it down into a form of thinking that no longer obscures, no longer acts as a filter that creates a certain view of life. We still will be seeing life in a subjective manner. It's just that it's a different sort of subjective than before. And that different subjective, when it comes in, feels like it is the end of subjective. It can feel like, and is often described as, the seeing things as they are. And it's not so much, I wouldn't say it is seeing things as they are. It just means that a certain layer of thinking that is reducing life down to something very reduced falls. And so what is left is what seems like a non-reduced version of life, which, if it was a completely non-reduced version of life, then we could say we are seeing what is. And so, relatively speaking, comparatively speaking, yes, we are seeing more of what is. And the aim is not to see life completely as it is in the absolute. It's simply for the layer of relativity that is suffering to fall away. That's enough for that layer of relativity to fall away. And that really happens by us questioning a lot of our thinking and seeing the nature of our thinking. And it doesn't mean that we end up no longer thinking. The problem is not having a thought or having a concept. It's having a concept and relating to it in a way that doesn't appreciate it as relative. So this is a nuance. Now, it's a nuance that might not be put forward at some times. At some points, it's more effective, let's say, for a teaching to say, stop thinking. for a teaching to say the problem is thinking. So this is another example of how a concept can be right in a certain context, or if understood what it's saying, it can be right, but it's not absolutely right. So a teaching will say the problem is thinking. Now, if we break thinking down into two types of thinking, the working mind and the thinking mind. So you have functional thinking that doesn't include in it essentially a sense of oneself. It's rather just looking at a situation and calculating some things, and doesn't have a sense of me and what I need in it. So there's functional thinking, the working mind, and then there is the thinking mind thinking, which is the type of thinking or the area of thinking in which suffering arises. Now, they're both forms of thinking. The functional thinking doesn't create suffering, and the thinking mind thinking is forced to include in it a sense of self that has to feel uncomfortable in life. So that does include thinking. So some people say thinking is the problem. Thinking must come to an end. Now, I understand why that's being said, and so I'm happy with that as a concept. I'm happy with that as an accurate concept, as long as we don't hold it absolutely accurate. Because if we were to say it is absolute and not relatively accurate, then it will be correct totally. So at other times, I will say that the problem is not thinking, but the problem is a certain type of thinking, the thinking mind. So if we take the concept that says thinking is the problem and we hold it absolutely, then it basically says that an enlightened person no longer thinks. Because if thinking is the problem and enlightenment is the end of that specific problem, then it means, okay, after enlightenment, no more thinking. And I would say that's not absolutely accurate. There is no more thinking of a certain sort. But remember here, I'm not saying, oh, well, it's not accurate, so it's wrong. I'm saying it's accurate within a certain context, because it hasn't said, if it says thinking is the problem, that statement hasn't necessarily said all thinking is the problem. It hasn't said that it's not saying that all thinking is a problem, but it hasn't said all thinking is the problem. It just says thinking is the problem. So if you come back onto this side and you see, okay, there's the working mind thinking, which Roger says is not problematic. There's the thinking mind thinking, which is the guilt and the blame and the pride and the worry and the expectation, all of which are very uncomfortable and what disturb peace of mind. That is thinking. So thinking is the problem. So that statement in the other, that thinking is the problem, when you look at what the problem is, it's the thinking mind, which is a type of thinking. So thinking, the problem is, when you look at it, what is the problem? It's guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which are all thinking. So the statement, thinking is the problem, is correct. If we take that statement and then we think it means all thinking is the problem, which it could, that statement could say, could be interpreted as all thinking is a problem, then it means that there's no flexibility, because we've taken that as absolute. And then nuances can't come in if we're holding on to something absolutely, which means we're not going to understand the whole. We're not going to understand it in a way as it, let's say, more accurately, well, not really more accurately, but more accurately when looking at things from a different context. So someone would say, well, if it's more accurate, why not use that? And it's not more accurate, it's more accurate from a certain perspective or within a certain context. So why would it'd be valid to say thinking is the problem without qualifying, without adding in the disclaimer that it's a certain type of thinking. It's more valid if, from a particular teaching point of view that is trying to break something, break the thinking mind, it's deemed that creating the distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind is not helpful. So it's not going to bring in that distinction. It has decided that is a confusion to do that its methodology is not to basically create a framework that delivers certain information, but rather put forward a framework that approaches the problem a different way. And so if we're exposed to those teachings that says thinking is the problem, and it's heard for a while as if it's all thinking, then what we might do is find ourselves moving through the day, often stopping any type of thinking, as much thinking as is possible. There will be a thought, oh, there I am thinking, just stop. And it might be that we're thinking about something functional that isn't causing suffering, and the thought comes up, says, stop your thinking. And it can create a habit of that can lead to moments of breakthrough because thinking has stopped. And another reason that we could say thinking is the problem is at a certain time, even the working mind thinking can be an obstacle. And so it's accurate to say thinking as a whole is a problem, and we need to learn or practice, or something needs to change in us such that thinking as a whole gets interrupted from time to time or regularly. And then once once our thinking habit has been interrupted sufficiently and there is a stabilizing in a place free of thought, that's when it's great to then hear about the difference between the working mind and the thinking mind. And there can be a reintroduction of or a different relationship to thinking that is not suffering. That that distinction is brought in, it may interfere with the efficacy of that particular teaching. So hopefully we are starting to see how a statement can be valid in one context, and the same statement or an opposite statement, the same statement may be invalid in another context, and in fact, the opposite statement might be valid in that other context. So in this example, we have thinking is the problem. In another context, we would say not all thinking is the problem. Now, they are opposite concepts, and they're both relatively accurate within the context of each framework. Now, as I was saying, if we can't understand a concept in its context and we take it as absolute, we then will find problem with what sounds like a counter concept. So if someone was to listen to the teaching that I'm putting forward, the teaching that Ramesh put forward, that speaks about how we essentially are biological robots forced in each moment to act according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, that our destiny is predetermined and unfolding, and in practice, how it unfolds is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. If someone hears that, has been exposed to that, and then they listen to, I can't remember his name, and I wouldn't have any problem saying his name because it isn't a criticism of what he's saying at all. They listen to this other teaching that is talking about how we can affect change in the body and healing, which I don't actually disagree with, but it's not us as a doer affecting it. It's a change in thinking that is actually a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And that can change physical structures in the body. So I have no problem with what is being said if it's said in the right context and heard that way. My point is that if someone were to listen to what I'm saying and then listen to what he says, they might think, oh, these two disagree strongly because Roger says that you are a biological robot, forced to function according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And he is saying, don't think that you are a slave to your genetics. You can change your genetics. And within the context of peace of mind that is disturbed by the existence of sin, and the suffering is based on the belief in personal doership, it's very important to see that there is no doer, but rather there is an automatic set of functions that are happening. And so the attitude of guilt and blame is founded in a belief that there are all these doers out there, all these separate entities that are completely in control about the way they think and the way they feel. And so in relation to peace of mind, with that objective, with that being the point that is being made, it's very valid to talk about biological robots functioning according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, because it's trying to highlight that it's our attitude of personal doership that is out of line with the description I put forward that is causing the suffering. Within a context of, if you think differently, you will affect change, where the importance is not to point out, that if you think differently, that's not because of you a doer, but rather because the teacher has said, think this way, and you might be surprised at what happens in your life. It's not important to point out that the only reason you are thinking that way is because you were prompted by life, by that teaching to think that way. That's not the point of that teaching. The point of the teaching is to get someone to think differently so that the physical change that the teaching says can happen may or may not happen. So that's the point of that teaching. So we might miss the nuance that says, oh, one teaching is talking about peace of mind predominantly and is putting forward the concepts that are valid to address the dynamics that relate to peace of mind. The other is talking about certain physical healing and the working of the immune system in the body. So it might be missed that they're talking about different topics, different objectives. So it means a discussion. What is the point of each discussion? And there are two different points. Might be missed, and then we hear the same concept, or one concept and a concept that is saying the complete and being forward as accurate in their context, and we go, okay, so that means one is right and one is wrong, because we've forgotten that they're talking about different points. Yes, I think it might be Joe Dispenza that I'm talking about. No, I don't. He's related to. No. So no, it's not Joe Dispenza, but it's someone I think connected to him. I'll mention it if I remember. So what is the point here? The point we're talking about is thinking, and how we don't often realize that our concepts are not held within the context, or not understood within the context that they have been designed to be delivered within. So that means that we need to refine how we hear things. So it becomes an example in ways that as a child, a concept is Santa Claus delivers lots of presents to all of the children in the world on Christmas Eve. That's a concept. And our child brain receives that and says, oh, that's the truth. And so, when we're 3 and 4 and 5 years old, we're looking up into the sky in Christmas Eve, and seeing lights in the sky and thinking that that's Santa Claus and his reindeers. And at a certain point, things happen in life that get us to see that is not the truth. Which doesn't mean that it wasn't a valid concept. As far as getting children to behave through the course of the year, and parents using it as a bribery tool for children to behave, otherwise Santa Claus won't deliver them any presents, or he'll deliver a bag of coal. Could say it's a valid concept relative to that objective. It can be said to be a valid concept as part of creating a mystical or fantastical part of life for children, as part of their entertainment, or part of their enjoyment as a child. And then from the context of, does Santa Claus really exist? We could say, well, that same concept that is valid in a certain context, or relative to a certain point, what is the point you're trying to achieve, becomes invalid. Now, we tend to be lucky in relation to some concepts, and they become obvious to us as to how we should hold them. There are many, many, many concepts that are held as beliefs that we have no idea are held as inappropriately, especially to our sense of self, as if we continued to hold on to the notion of Santa Claus as being an actual entity in life that has reindeers and goes around in a sled, lives in the North Pole and delivers presents to billions of children on one night. I can't really put it any plainer than that, is that many structures in our system hold concepts about fairly mundane life in a way that is how do I say it? That is maybe accurate from certain perspectives, definitely not accurate from all perspectives, and yet that concept is held as if that is accurate as a truth, and therefore the capacity to know the other perspectives, to hold the other perspectives, isn't available. So the other day I was driving, and I was driving past a big industrial site, and there was a very big warehouse, and it said Jesus spray painted on the side of the warehouse. And it got me thinking. It's like, well, I figured, it was a big warehouse. Someone required, it looked like it had been done by vandals, or, by someone using spray cans. But having said that, it was 4 stories up and a very big J and a very big E and S and U and S that seemed to require some sort of cherry picker type machinery to get it done. And it got me thinking about, someone has gone to a lot of effort to write Jesus on the side of the thing. And I thought, well, Jesus was very probably nothing like the idea people hold about Jesus. Maybe he didn't even exist. Maybe he existed as a very wise person putting forward a teaching. That's a probability, I would say, that there was a figure in history that had lots of insight. But I think Jesus put forward lots of stories, what are they, parables, that are used because they are stories, and storytelling is very effective to bring across points, to bring across themes. And if we're not capable of hearing the story and understanding that the story is a concept, and hearing why the concept is valid and that it's not absolute, we might actually think that Jesus healed the blind instead of hearing that as a metaphor for his capacity to get people to see things more clearly. And, if we don't have a capacity to listen to things and apply lateral thinking, which means if our thinking doesn't just go to what it imagines when it hears something the first time, and sort of if our thinking doesn't ask, what else could this mean? Then we hear a story about how Jesus healed the blind, and our thinking will assume he healed someone who couldn't see out of their physical eyes. And maybe it's a metaphor for lifting a veil of relativity, lifting a veil of thought. He is purported to have said that he is the Son of God. Now, that is that doesn't mean we're not all sons of God. If we hear that he's talking about him as a person is the Son of God, and that therefore all people are the sons and daughters of God, and then we might not ask, what does that mean? If we see that God might be life, and he's saying that, could be saying that life has manifested as human individuals, and that each human individual, along with all of the animals and all of the trees and nature, are the fruits of God, the creation of God. That human beings are the Father incarnate, source incarnate, source in manifestation. And the notion of spirit is consciousness in manifestation. So the Trinity, which are 3 but not 1, is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we might see the Father as the unmanifest, the Son as the manifest, and the Spirit being that which is functioning through the body. So in this teaching, the human being, what is a human being? A human being is a body-mind organism. So the physical entity, body-mind organism through which the consciousness of source functions. So the consciousness of God linked to this body-mind organism and functions through this body-mind organism. And they're described as three: the source or God, the consciousness of source or God, and the body-mind organism. The combination of those is the human being. And so it's described as three, but they are actually one. And so there's all sorts of ways. And in the end, I thought, well, what harm does it make if people misinterpret, have an idea about a belief about Jesus, a belief about certain religions, for example. If it gives them some sort of comfort, then it's relatively okay. And then we have to look at it and see that, yes, but the belief can often turn into not only a source of relative comfort, but it can be what we've been having, wars over for thousands of years. So in the end, I think that the more and more our thinking adjusts to create less beliefs, to start being able to feel and see things more clearly, then the more we tend to change towards having a capacity of living life, taking it less personally, and with less suffering arising in life. So there are so many spiritual concepts that are accurate in a certain context. In a certain context, I could say, what we are is not the body. If someone is presenting with a certain interpretation of life, talking about their suffering and how there's no relief from feelings of shame or expectation or worry or blame, then it may in that moment seem like, okay, the problem is unquestioned identification as the person, as that person knows themselves. So that means a sense of being something that in experience is heavily, the experience is heavily affected by these beliefs that I'm talking about. So when a belief is in place, especially a belief of who we are, and that belief often is based on how our experience of life feels and has felt throughout life. So it feels a certain way, the belief gets in play, put in place, and the belief can keep us feeling and knowing ourselves that way. And so if someone is saying, is there anything you can suggest that might bring about a change? It might in that moment feel like, okay, what needs to happen is for a contact, an awakening, a sense, connection with something that is freer, or an aspect of the human being that is freer, that tends to be heavily covered up by a certain form of thinking. And it can be helpful to point out that from a certain perspective, there are experiences in life that can arise where the sense of being the body is there, that the sense that is there when we rest in it and are really present with it, really really equates to us knowing in a way, what is this really telling me? What is this feeling? If I am just with the feeling and don't put any concepts from my past on it, what is it? What is it revealing? And there are awakening experiences that are awakening us to the spirit aspect of the human being. And when the spirit aspect comes forward in Sanskrit, the word is svarana. And svarana means the bursting forth. Aham svarana, actually. The svarana means bursting forth, and the aham is I am. So it's the bursting forth of I am. And the I am is not talking about I am this or that thought. It's not talking about a thought that says I am this or that. The I am, as it's spoken about within non-duality, when non-duality is talking about I am, what it's talking about is the spirit, the essence of the human being. And when we rest there, it's a non-conceptual sense of being. And without any thinking, if we don't bring any thinking into it, we don't bring any ideas into it, and we just rest there to see what's it telling us. And one of the things it tells us is existence. There is existence right now. That is undeniable. I am. But in that moment, the I is not referring to the body. The sense in that moment is, in fact, what I am as this formless awareness, it turns out, is one of the words that describes it most accurately. When we rest there and say, I want to be able to feel this, so that afterwards I can most effectively describe it in a way that is useful. Not because describing it makes it more real or gives me more of myself, because we don't need to describe it, because we realize, oh, this is important. This is part of a human development that is available to everyone. And so if we can describe it well, that can be useful. Useful only as a pointer, as an awakening, as a something that might trigger something for someone else. Not as some truth, but as a pointer. And so the pointer, as it's felt from that particular perspective. So I'm not saying that this is the absolute truth. It's a particular state that can present. And it reveals something important. It's the bursting forth of I am, the I am landing on center stage, whereas it previously was in backstage. And so we might say, you are not the body. You spent your whole life completely identified with being the body. What you truly are, your true essence, has nothing to do with the body. The body is an appearance that arises inside this that you are. All of the objects arise inside this that you are. So I can't possibly be talking about you as a body, because I'm talking about the body arising inside of you rather than you arising inside of the body. I'm talking about all of the objects, the trees, the table and chairs, the other people, all arising inside what you are. Don't try and think about it. The pointer might say, thinking is what keeps us disconnected from a realization of what we truly are. Let go of the notion, if possible, that the table is a physical object. Let go of the notion that the tree is real. All of these things are appearances, subjective modulations, creations within the consciousness of the world. Don't worry about any descriptions that talk about time and space and why things happen. Any description that talks about genes and this leading to that, all of that is secondary and actually not really accurate from the perspective of seeing all of this arising in the present moment. It didn't come from anywhere. There is no past and there is no future. There is just this present moment as it's arising. And what you are has nothing to do with the body. What you are is that in which all of this comes and goes. Now, all of those concepts, those descriptions are accurate. None of them are the truth. Because from another point of view, we would say, well, the consciousness is only here because it's functioning through the body. If someone were to shoot a bullet through the head of the body would die, and the experience that is being had of tables and chairs and people and the body, we can assume for most intents and purposes, not to say that we believe this is truth, but if we start looking at a lot of evidence and how the manifestation, how certain things in the manifestation correlate, we will see that if the body were to die, the experience of the world will die with it. Now, that doesn't mean that the concepts that say what you are has nothing to do with the body. It doesn't mean that that is wrong. It means that from a certain perspective and a certain way of knowing life at maybe different phases of the process or at different times throughout the day, once the process has gone through many phases, there can be different changes in how the day is experienced. Not that one is more enlightened than the other, but rather that they are just shifting ways of knowing life, knowing yourself, that can shift throughout the day, not dissimilar to having your eyes open and then for a moment closing them. It's not that one way of knowing life is valid and, let's say, closing your eyes is not valid. There are different modes in which life can be known. And so the descriptions from each perspective are accurate. And if we can bring them together and see how they maybe complement each other, that they can coexist, that they are two sides of a paradox, that we might be both or neither, or maybe we are one thing and those are two manifestations of being human, two modes of humanness, where one mode is the human knowing itself as a body in a world with consciousness, and the other mode is feeling primarily the consciousness and seeing the body as an object within the consciousness. They're both, as I see it, accurate, but we can talk about life from different perspectives to aid in different changes. Another paradox. What does it mean when we're told the world is not real? And why is that not absolutely true? And why is it relatively true? And then we have to ask ourselves, can we have something, can we have a relative truth? Or is that an oxymoron? Because truth, if we hold that word in a certain way, if we have a certain definition of truth, truth means absolute. And so how can we have a relative truth? So someone would say you can't have a relative truth, that they're incompatible. But if you've been hearing the whole topic of today's satsang, it's talking about how you can have a concept that is accurate from a certain perspective. And so clearly I'm not using the word truth when we say it's a relative truth. We're saying it's a concept that is accurate from a certain perspective. And we don't want to throw away relative or accurate concepts from certain perspectives because they're very useful. So let's see what is meant by, the world is not real. And then let's also see why we can't hold that absolutely. And if we do, we may actually be deluded to some extent because it's a relative truth and not an absolute truth. So if we hold a relative truth as absolute, we are missing out on a half of the paradox. So the reason that the universe or the world is said to be not real within the context of non-dual teachings is really to highlight to us when it says the world is not real or the universe is not real, what it's really talking about, at least from one of the ways that can be used, is when it's talking about our experience of the world, which is really all we ever have of life. Life is our life, is our experience of the world, our experience of life. So we've mistaken our experience of life, which is all we've ever had, as being the world. Now, it is our experience of the world. This nuance, our experience of the world, is dropped away. We think it's irrelevant. We just haven't ever grown up saying, all I ever have is my experience of the world. We touch on it sometimes because one of our friends or we might think about it. Well, if we think about it, we maybe are not falling into this general tendency I'm talking about. But our friend might mention, the subjectivity of our experience. And someone might talk about the color red and what is the color red really? Is the color red for you the same as the color red for someone else? And so that topic is touching on the subjectivity of life, the complete subjectivity of life. And, we might be interested in having that conversation for 5 minutes in a year, and then the rest of the time it becomes sort of irrelevant. Until it doesn't, until we start maybe appreciating that our whole life is a subjective experience of life created by something. And one way of looking at it is, so if I bring in the notion of a fly and the fly's experience of life, is who knows what it is, but the likelihood is a fly doesn't see the world in the way that you or I see the world. Let's say there are some sort of visuals of a fly. It's I hope you can fill in the blanks here, but let's say a whole lot of dark with some white movement here and there, and the fly operates within that impression representation of the world. So it's a fly's representation of the world, meaning the world that is represented as seen through the instrument of the fly is radically different from the human's representation of the world. And a frog may see a fly, but not in the way we see a fly. So frog's sensory system knows to reach out at something in its experience, and often it ends up with a fly in its mouth. But a frog has a particular representation of the world in which it lives. And humans have a particular representation of the world in which we live. And we have, once again, made the mistake of taking the relative as being absolute. So if we contrast, as a thought experiment, the notion of the world the fly knows, the world a dog knows, the world a frog knows, and the world a human knows, and we realize they are all relative representations. And the fact is that our representation may be much more detailed than a fly's representation, and yet it may be not very detailed at all. If we had complete detail of the world as it really is, our representation of that would probably equate to nothing, in that it would be so full that there would probably be no distinction. If our representation of the world was to know the world as it really was, I guess it means that we wouldn't be able to see surface distinctions And maybe that means we would see everything at its very base, which may be nothing. So I'll throw in at this point that according to this teaching, the mission is not to know reality. It's really peace of mind in daily living. And why we hear about reality and a seeking for truth is because what disturbs peace of mind is suffering, and suffering arises on a whole lot of beliefs that are taking the relative and holding it as absolute. And so a seeking for truth actually gets us to see all of the things that are relative that have been held as true, and for us to let go of them in that context, to let go of that relationship to relative things, which includes our experience of life. Our experience, it includes thoughts and feelings. We start to register that feelings are something that come and go, and that a feeling isn't necessarily telling us the truth. We see that our thinking about what someone is thinking about us may not be the truth. We maybe start to see that we can think something about a topic where we're sure we're right, and in fact we're wrong. And so we tend to start finding that our attitude towards the relative is an attitude of its relative. And that is the falling away of the the non-truth that is a problem. I think one of the ironies is that when we're seeking for truth, what we actually come to as realization about truth is that there is no truth that we will know, that we can know. We can, the best definition of truth is what is. But if we then think, oh, and when my beliefs have fallen away, then I know what is. We'll then think, oh, when I know what is, I know the truth. Now, actually, the statement I just made, the best definition of truth is what is really more a theoretical definition, because what is, as I said, is not knowable to us. If we actually knew what is, the world would probably be nothing. So what is basically saying the truth is what it is. So it's not knowable, it's not describable. In the Bible, one of the times God presented himself in one of the stories to Moses was in the story of the burning bush, and when Moses was startled, and I'm not sure if this, maybe it was one of the other founding forefathers, and was astonished and startled by the burning bush. And it's like, who are you? I am that I am. That really is, so it was a representation of God, but God as source, not as something, but as a representation of all that is. So it's a non-descriptive description. It's about as safe a description of truth as you can have. What is, and I am that I am, is like saying, I'm not going to tell you this is what I am, because as soon as I this is what I am. I've reduced myself down to something. And the truth is too big to be put into a reduced concept. So when we're seeking as seekers for truth, I think the end of the road is when we really truly realize the nature of truth and the nature of human experience, enlightened or unenlightened, but even the nature of enlightened experience is by its very nature subjective. It may be less subjective than the unenlightened view, which has a lot of beliefs that makes it very subjective, because we're seeing it through an extra filter of subjectivity, the extra filter of the beliefs. But when those beliefs fall, we still have a very subjective experience of, even when we know ourselves as the awareness in which the whole experience arises, knowing that that experience is not separate from that which is aware of it, that it is made of the stuff that is aware of it. Even from that perspective, which is a much less relative perspective, it's still not truth. But it's enough truth to have solved the problem of suffering. And that enough truth is not to be seeing it from an absolute point of view, but rather for certain relativity, certain filters to have fallen away. So what does it mean that the world is not real? Essentially, it's trying to point out our experience of the world, which is all we ever had, is exactly that, an experience. It is an arising in consciousness. Consciousness is that which is aware of experience. And that the objects that seem like they are objective are contained within the experience, and the objectivity is a expression within that experience. It is an expression, a subjective expression designed to appear like an objective reality. And so once again, we have mistaken the subjective for the absolute. And so because the subjective is a subjective experience designed to present as an objective reality, what has happened is that the assumption is, oh, I know I have the experience of a table that feels objectively real. And so therefore it is objectively real. And the teachings come in and say, the world is not real. They're nudges and concepts that are designed to change us in radically different ways. And if we then take that concept and hold on to it too strongly as an absolute truth, when we realize that this is all a subjective reality, that concept that keeps saying the world is not real may persist in a way that prevents us from integrating in such a way that allows us to then live as if the world is real. Not pretending, but where you say, but in practice, my relationship with the table is such that I will go and put a plate on it. And when I put a plate on it, I expect the plate to remain on it. And, when I'm driving, I don't think that I can drive my car through a tree because it's not real. So at some point, we have to realize the validity of the concept that the world is not real as a relative truth and be able to hold the world is real as a relative truth. So in practice, we live as if the world is real. That doesn't then mean that we have lost touch with the fact that the experience of the world arises as an experience within consciousness, which means we get to live as if I am the body, as if the world is real, while still having whatever changes have happened. And we could describe it as a connection to the core of ourself that is a self-contenting component of the human being. So something that, if it's overlooked, if it's not appreciated, if it's unknown, if it's not realized, can then mean that the human being knows themselves without the benefit of that. And that really means a human experience that is much more threatening than when we have a contact to a part of ourself that is relatively consistent. So I'll round off today's talk by saying teachings are wonderful, not the truth. They have an immense amount of wisdom in them. They come about because life has changed those that are delivering the words in such a way that they have not out of any personal achievement that they can claim absolute ownership over. It was from one perspective, we can say absolutely lucky that life presented in this way, that life hit them, chiseled them to be that way. And from another perspective, we can say, well, it's not without its effort that happened, because those people in history were forced in a way to dedicate their life to a certain type of thinking, a certain type of activity. And luckily, the cumulative efforts of everyone that came through a particular lineage or a particular, not just a particular path, but this path of self-discovery or change, then shares that, which means we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. We don't have to keep going through the process from start to finish, because a lot of the insights, a lot of the process get condensed down into specific practices, into specific concepts that highlight the things that were hidden, which doesn't mean that we just get told the truth and that's it. We get given the concepts so that we can, it's like, we look at these, it's like looking at the optical illusions in a poster, and you can look at it and you just don't see what's there. You see one pattern, and someone's saying, look, just if you blink your eyes really quick, you might see what's there. And so you blink your eyes really quick and you still see watermelons. And so then they say, well, just stare at the center and allow your vision to open up. No, still watermelons. And they say, well, try this each day. And then someone else comes in and says, oh, what helped for me is that I put a blue light in the background. And so you put the blue light in the background and suddenly it's, I see it. I see the, I don't know, oasis. Whereas previously I just saw watermelons. And if someone hadn't told you to put a blue light in the background, you may have been destined to just see watermelons for the rest of your life. And so we still have to travel the path, but we get to travel the path with the benefit of a guide, let's say, instructions.